On the night of November 6, 1951, a car pulled off a dark clay road somewhere in the scrubland of rural Florida. There were no streetlights out here, no houses within earshot, nothing but flat, dark wilderness stretching in every direction and the smell of pine resin and red clay hanging in the warm night air. Inside that car were 3 men. Behind the wheel sat Willis McCall, sheriff of Lake County, 6'1", over 200 pounds, the most powerful man in this part of Florida for the better part of a decade. In the back seat, handcuffed together at the wrist, were Samuel Shepard and Walter Irvin, 2 24-year-old black men on their way to a retrial the United States Supreme Court had just ordered. 2 men who had already spent 2 years on death row for a crime they had not committed. McCall said he had a flat tire. He ordered both men out of the car. What happened next, Walter Irvin would describe to the FBI from a hospital bed, his chest torn open, a bullet lodged in his neck, his best friend dead in the Florida clay somewhere behind him. He said there was no struggle, said there was no escape attempt, said McCall pulled his weapon without a word of warning and fired. Samuel went down. Walter went down beside him, still handcuffed to Samuel's wrist, and in the single second between hitting the ground and losing consciousness, he made the only decision that could save his life. He went completely still. He lay face down in the dirt, cheek against the warm Florida clay, blood spreading slow and dark beneath him, and he did not move, did not cry out, did not make a sound that suggested he was anything other than dead. He felt the ground against his skin, still holding the day's heat the way Florida earth does, long after sunset. He could smell the iron of his own blood mixing with the dust. He could hear Samuel making sounds nearby, the sounds a body makes when it is losing the fight to stay in the world. And he lay there and he listened and he did not move. The sound stopped. Then he heard the boots, slow and deliberate on the gravel, moving towards Samuel first. The boots of a man who is not afraid, the boots of a man who is finishing something he started. One more shot split the night open. Then the boots moved toward Walter. He felt the shadow of the man standing over him before he heard anything else, felt the shift in the air the way you feel a storm coming before a single drop falls. And he lay in that dirt with 3 bullets in his body, and he made himself into something that wasn't there, made himself into the ground itself. He did not move when Willis McCall stood over him. He did not move when McCall decided he was done. He lay there until other headlights swept the road and other voices arrived, and he listened to Willis McCall tell those voices his version of what had happened, the escape attempt, the struggle, the self-defense, and he held every word of it inside his chest along with the bullets, because he understood that the only reason he was still breathing was because Willis McCall believed he wasn't. Walter Irvin survived that night. Samuel Shepard did not. Hi, I'm T, and this is Black Crime Noir. If stories about black lives, black history, and the cases that mainstream history buried are your thing, you're exactly where you need to be. We dig up these stories and share new ones every week. Before we go any further, subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss any of our uploads. Let's get into it. To understand how 2 innocent men ended up handcuffed together on a dark road with a sheriff standing over them, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the case, the beginning of the men. Samuel Shepard was born in Georgia in 1927 and grew up in Groveland, Florida, on land his father Henry had built into something extraordinary. Henry Shepard had taken former swampland, land nobody else wanted, land that had to be drained and cleared by hand over years of backbreaking labor, and turned it into a working farm with his name on the deed. a black man who owned his own land in Lake County, Florida in the 1940s. That farm wasn't just property, it was a declaration that Henry Shepherd and everything he came from could not be kept in the place the county had assigned him. And there were men in Lake County who had resented that declaration for years before his son ever put on a uniform. Samuel went to war in 1945. He came home to that farm, to his father's land, to the life that was waiting for him. And when he walked back through Groveland, he was still wearing his army uniform, not as a provocation, not as a statement, but because he had earned it, and he knew it, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. The man beside him, wearing his own uniform the same way, was Walter Irvin. Walter had grown up in Groveland, and had known Samuel since they were boys. They had gone to war the same year, served together, come home together, and now they were navigating the particular indignity of being two young black veterans in a county that had very specific ideas about how much dignity a black man was allowed to carry. Walter was working the citrus rows at Upshawa Groves, up before sunrise and back after dark, trying to build something forward. Samuel was working on his father's farm. They were 22 years old and they had survived a world war, and they were still somehow trying to find their footing in a county that had decided their footing didn't matter. And then there was Ernest Thomas, a 26-year-old man married to a woman named Ruby and working near Groveland that summer. He was the kind of man who looked out for people. When he heard about work in the citrus groves, he sent word to a young friend back in Gainesville, told him to come on down. There were jobs, he would meet him at the depot. That young friend was Charles Greenley. He was 16 years old. He had a wife at home whose pregnancy was just beginning to show, and the weight of that responsibility was sitting on the shoulders of a teenager who had barely figured out how to take care of himself. He packed what he had and made the journey to Groveland and arrived at the rail depot and sat down to wait for Ernest Thomas to meet him. Ernest Thomas never came. Charles Greenley was sitting at that depot, 16 years old, new in town, knowing nobody, carrying nothing but the hope of a job, when the police arrived and took him in. He had never met Samuel Shepherd, had never met Walter Irvin, had nothing to do with anything that was about to descend on all of them. The evening of July 16th, 1949 began with a dance. Norma Paget and her husband Willie had been drinking at a local American Legion hall. A detail that matters because nothing about what came next was simple, and the people who benefited from it being simple made sure the complicated parts were never examined properly. Their marriage was a difficult one. Willie drank, and there were stories around Groveland about what that sometimes meant for Norma. The two of them had separated after barely 6 months together and were only recently trying to patch things up. Their car broke down on a rural road outside town sometime after midnight. What actually happened on that road has never been established with certainty, because the investigation that followed had no genuine interest in establishing it. What Gilbert King's Pulitzer Prize-winning account of the case documented, from FBI files that had been buried for decades, is that Samuel Shepherd and Walter Irvin did stop to help. That Shepherd and Willie Paget got into a physical confrontation, most likely after Willie made a racist remark toward the two veterans, that the men eventually left. What Norma Paget told the police the following morning was that 4 black men had attacked her husband and sexually assaulted her. The doctor who examined her found no physical evidence consistent with what she described, no injuries consistent with the violence alleged, no forensic evidence of any kind. The footprints found near the car did not match the shoes of any of the 4 accused men. There was nothing, not a thread of physical evidence connecting any of them to what Norma Paget claimed had happened. None of it mattered, because Willis McCall had the case by morning and Willis McCall was not interested in evidence. Willis McCall had been running Lake County since 1944, and he ran it the way certain men run things when nobody has ever made them answer for anything. The Grove owners needed cheap labor, and he provided it by making sure black workers in Lake County understood at all times that organizing was not something they were permitted to do, and that leaving was not something they were easily permitted to do either. The old Lake County money needed the social order maintained, and he maintained it with a thoroughness that went well beyond the letter of the law and into something more personal. more deliberate, more enjoyed. He was not simply a brutal man in the way that some men are casually brutal. He was a man who understood racial violence as a system of governance, and he administered that system with something close to professional pride. The white felt hat, the black string tie, the polished boots worn every single day were not affectations. They were the costume of a man who understood that power is partly performance, and who had been performing it for long enough that the performance and the man had become the same thing. He had 4 names before the sun came up on July 17th: Samuel Shepherd, Walter Irvin, Ernest Thomas, and Charles Greenley. These names were not obtained from evidence but from the same logic that had always governed Lake County. A white woman had spoken, black men were available. The investigation began and ended there. He picked up Shepherd and Irvin first. He drove them to a secluded spot before taking them anywhere near a jail, and had his deputies pull them from the car and work them over with blackjacks on the ground, boots going in, while voices asked them whether they had picked up a white girl the night before. Then he took them to the basement of the Lake County Jail, where both men were handcuffed to overhead pipes and beaten with a thoroughness that left marks NAACP attorneys photographed weeks later and brought to federal investigators as documented evidence of what had been done. Shepherd's injuries included scars across his back and chest, broken teeth, a tooth that had been punched clean through his upper lip, and the deep wrist marks of the pipes. Walter Irvin had a fractured jaw, lash marks across his torso, bruising so extensive it covered him from shoulder to hip. They were beaten until they gave the men what they wanted. Samuel Shepherd broke. He signed the confession. He said the words that made it stop. Because the human body has limits, and Samuel Shepherd had reached his. Walter Irvin did not break. Through the pipes and the hours and the basement and the fractured jaw and the body that was being systematically destroyed around him, Walter Irvin looked at the men doing it to him and refused. Refused to sign, refused to confess, refused to give them a single word they could use against him in a courtroom. His jaw was fractured and he refused. His body was marked from shoulder to hip and he refused. Whatever they did in that basement, they could not get out of Walter Irvin the one thing they needed most, and they knew it, and they kept trying, and he kept refusing. 16-year-old Charles Greenley, beaten alone in a cell, without a parent, without a lawyer, without a single person in the world who could help him, gave them what they wanted. He was a child. He said the words that made it stop. No one who has not been 16 years old and alone and in that kind of pain has the right to judge him for it. Ernest Thomas ran the moment he understood what was coming for him, and he made it 10 days through the Florida wilderness before a posse of 1,000 men tracked him into Madison County and found him sleeping under a tree. They shot him more than 400 times. Ernest Thomas never saw the inside of a courtroom. He was the first of the 4 to die, and he died having never been charged, never been tried, never been given a single moment to say what he knew. That same night in Groveland, a mob burned Henry Shepherd's farm to the ground. The land his father had cleared by hand from swamp over the course of a lifetime. The deed with the Shepherd name on it, everything that farm had stood for, gone in a single night while Samuel sat in a basement with his wrists on a pipe and the taste of blood in his mouth. Not one person was ever charged for burning it. The trial came in September 1949, and it was not a trial in any meaningful sense of the word. 9 defense attorneys declined the case before it began. The threats were explicit enough, the atmosphere violent enough, that experienced lawyers looked at what was waiting for them in Lake County and walked away. The courthouse was surrounded by an armed crowd on the day the verdict was delivered. The all-white jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Shepherd and Irvin, death Greenley because of his age, life in prison. Walter Irvin, who had survived that basement without giving them a single word, who had refused to confess while his jaw was being fractured around him, was sentenced to die for something he had not done and something he had never admitted to doing. The NAACP sent Thurgood Marshall, their lead attorney, the man who would one day become the first Black Supreme Court justice in American history, to take the appeal. Marshall had been to the South before. He knew what it cost a black man to walk into a Lake County courtroom and call what had happened there unjust. He went anyway, under death threats that followed him from the moment he arrived in Florida, and he built the case that the Supreme Court of the United States ultimately could not ignore. In 1951, the court overturned the convictions of Shepard and Irvin. Their ruling described the trial and its surrounding atmosphere as one of the worst menaces to American justice the court had encountered. New trial ordered. Willis McCall was given the job of transporting both men to Lake County for that new trial. He chose to drive them himself, alone, at night, on a clay road that went nowhere. Anyone was watching. Walter told the FBI everything from that hospital bed, and he told it the same way every single time he was asked. Clearly, completely, without hesitation or variation. There was no flat tire, there was no struggle, there was no escape attempt. McCall pulled off the road, ordered them out of the car, and without exchanging another word, he drew his weapon and fired. Samuel went down. Walter went down beside him, still handcuffed to the man he had known since childhood, to the man whose father's farm had been burned while they were both in a basement together. And he chose in the fraction of a second between the bullet hitting him and the ground coming up to meet him to be completely, utterly, absolutely still. He lay there with the warm Florida clay against his cheek and his blood going into the ground beneath him, and he listened to Samuel's sounds getting quieter, and he did not move. He felt McCall's boots stop near Samuel. He heard the final shot. He felt the change in the air as those boots turned toward him and stopped, close enough that he could have reached out and touched them if he had been willing to move, which he was not, which he would not be, not for anything. He lay there in the dirt next to his best friend's body until other cars came and other voices arrived on that road, and Willis McCall began his explanation, and Walter Irvin held every word of that lie inside his ruined chest and waited. The FBI investigated afterward, and their forensic findings said exactly what Walter Irvin had said. The physical evidence supported murder and attempted murder, not self-defense. Not a thwarted escape. Murder carried out on a dark road by a sheriff who had decided that a Supreme Court order was something he could simply drive around. A coroner's jury of local white men ruled the shooting justifiable. McCall drove back to Lake County and went back to work. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP paid for Samuel Shepard's funeral. Walter Irvin was given several weeks to recover from his wounds, and then he was put on trial again for the same crime. The prosecution offered him a deal during that second trial: plead guilty to the rape of Norma Paget and the state would spare his life. Thurgood Marshall himself convinced the jury would convict and convinced the judge would sentence him to death again, urged Walter to take it. Better to be alive, Marshall reasoned. Better to fight another day from inside a prison than to die for the principle of it. Walter Irvin looked at that deal and refused it. He had not said those words in the basement when his jaw was being fractured around him. He was not going to say them in a courtroom with his life on the table. He told them he would not admit to something he had not done, and he meant it, and no amount of reasoning from the man who was trying to save him could change it. The jury convicted him again, death sentence again. 4 more years on death row before Governor Leroy Collins, who had reviewed the case and told people privately he was not convinced of Irvin's guilt, commuted the sentence to life in prison in 1955. Willis McCall was re-elected sheriff in 1952, and again in 1956, and again in 1960, and again in 1964. Charles Greenley was paroled in 1962. He moved to Nashville. He carried Groveland inside him for the rest of his life and rebuilt what he could of it, which was never as much as had been taken. Walter Irvin remained in Rayford Prison. In 1968, 19 years after that basement, 17 years after that road, Walter Irvin walked out of Rayford Prison on parole. He was 41 years old. He had given the 2 decades of his life that a person never gets back, the 20s and 30s, the years when most people are building something, becoming someone, laying the foundations of the life they are going to live, to a cell in a Florida prison for something that had never happened. His parole conditions required him to live in Miami, far from Lake County. He went. He was out. He was breathing air that wasn't Rayford's air, walking on ground that wasn't Rayford's ground, and whatever came next was going to be his. In February 1969, less than 1 year after Walter Irvin walked out of Rayford Prison, he returned to Lake County for the first time. His uncle had died. He went back for the funeral. Walter Irvin died there, heart attack. He died at 41 in Lake County, Florida, with no apology from anyone, no acknowledgement that a single wrong had been done, no judge anywhere saying his name was clean. There was no book yet, no pardon, no hearing, no exoneration, just Walter Irvin, gone at 41, in the county that had tried to kill him twice, 1 year after the state of Florida finally let him go. Gilbert King's book came in 2012 and won the Pulitzer Prize and forced the story back into the light. The Florida legislature issued an apology to the families in 2017. Governor Ron DeSantis granted full posthumous pardons to all 4 men in 2019, and at that hearing, Norma Paget, 92 years old and brought in by wheelchair, looked at the board and said she was begging them not to grant the pardon because they had done it. She died in 2024 and took whatever she knew with her to her grave. The full exoneration came in 2021, 72 years after that basement in Lake County. A judge vacated the convictions and dismissed the indictments. Carol Greenley, Charles Greenley's daughter, stood in the courtroom and said what she had needed to say for decades, that her father was a caring, loving, compassionate person who did not rape anybody. Willis McCall, the sheriff, had been dead for 27 years by then. He died in 1994, free in his bed, having served as sheriff until 1972, having never spent a single day in a cell, having never answered for a single thing he did. Ernest Thomas, Samuel Shepard, Walter Irvin, Charles Greenley. One man shot 400 times in his sleep in a Florida swamp. One man executed in handcuffs on a dark road by the sheriff who was supposed to be transporting him to justice. One man who survived everything they threw at him, the pipes, the bullets, the 2 death sentences, and died at 41 with nothing restored, 1 year into the freedom he had waited 19 years for. And one boy, 16 years old, waiting at a train station for his friend, who gave 13 years of his life to a prison cell for it. We say these names because the system decided their names didn't matter, but they deserve to be remembered. I'll see you in the next one.